let's see. Okay, so not under the law. Let's look at this. I would argue you could say, and there is a sense that we're under the law, according to Paul's words, that phrase, under the law. Okay, so we're just not under the old covenant law, if you want to say it that way. To those who are under, so he's talking about Jews and Gentiles here, winning them to Christ. For I'm free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more, Jews and Gentiles. And to the Jews I become as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those that are under the law. So this is, so think about it. This is connecting the under the law thing to Jews that aren't receiving Messiah. He's talking, when he says we're not under the law, he's got to be talking to Jews, right? Because Jews were the ones under the law. They had the law of Moses, not the Gentiles. They don't know about that, quote unquote, right? In a certain sense. So this connects him when he's talking about Jews. Jews are under the law. Why? Because if they don't receive Messiah, the law condemns them. That's what Romans says. But he says there's some sense that the law condemns everyone because of their conscience and the natural law. When they do things that are under the law, they're a law unto themselves, you know. And the Jews are hypocrites because they have the law and they still don't keep it. So obviously, under the law has to do with being condemned by the law, because he's speaking about the Jews here. And then he says, look, then he contrasts to those who are without the law as without law. So he becomes like a Gentile to Gentiles and like a Jew to Jews to relate to them, to win them to Christ. Notice what it says, though. When he becomes like one without the law, he says, not being without law toward God, but under the law. Look, it says, Paul's saying, I'm not saying I'm without law. I'm neither under the law in the context of talking about the Jews who are not saved and believing in Messiah. So Paul's neither under the law like a Jew, but when he says without law like the Gentiles, who need to be one, both groups need to be one. The Jew who's under the condemnation of the law for not receiving Messiah, and Gentiles who are condemned, which he describes in Romans, is people without the law, but they're still condemned to the natural law because they're made in the image of God. And then Paul says, not being without law toward God. Now you can apply that to just the phrase about the Gentiles being without law. So what's the point here? But he says, I'm not that I'm without the law towards God, but I'm under the law toward Christ. What does that mean? It means the ministration of death under Moses is now the ministration of Christ. So obviously the not being under the law means the condemnation of the old covenant, because the new covenant has come with forgiveness, with mercy, with grace. So he's like, look, I'm not without law of God. I'm under the law through Christ. Well, what did Christ teach? He didn't do away with the law. So look at what he said, that I might win those who are without law. So is a saved person in Messiah without law? No, they're under the law through Christ. So are we under the law? Yes, we're under the law of Christ. That's what it says. So obviously under the law in the context of speaking of this transitional period with the covenants, the ones he says who are under the law, it's like saying they're condemned by the law because they're not receiving Jesus. It's not saying they're not under the law. So the not under the law certainly doesn't mean being without the law of God, does it? According to Paul. According to Paul, he makes it clear. Look, I'm not saying I'm not under God's law. I'm under it through Christ. That's covenant language. So here's another application. I mean, what does Paul say? Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing. He says that 2 chapters earlier, right here. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. It's kind of a big deal, isn't it? What are the commandments? And then this is where people try to say, well, it's not the 10 commandments. Oh, really? Oh, really? Is that true? No, that's absolutely false for sure. Why? Oh, no man anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. The law, the commandments he's talking about that are not burdensome are certainly the 10 commandments. How do I know that? Because he quotes them. He references them. Look, Jesus fulfilled the law. That means he did the law. He never sinned. To justify us as humans, he never sinned, the spotless lamb. So fulfilled the law does mean Jesus kept the law perfectly. because that's what fulfill means. It means do. To fulfill something is to do it. So if you have God's love in you, you do the law. That's what this says. That's what that says. Why? Because he who said, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. And if there be any other commandment, it's summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Why? Because to love someone is to keep the commandments and not commit adultery with them, not steal from them, not covet. This is not questionable, because love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the doing of the law, fulfillment of it. Yes, you have to love your neighbor. You have to, or you don't know God, according to John. Does that mean you're saved by your works? Didn't say that. You're saved by Christ alone, justified by Christ's merit. That makes you right before God. Otherwise, you're condemned by the law. It's supposed to drive you to Christ, and then he transforms you. That's what the text teaches. I know a lot of theology doesn't like it, and you can call me a works-based salvationist, but the law of liberty is walking in the love of God. Doesn't matter now. It does matter now. How much more does it matter now that the Spirit of Christ has been given to us? According to Paul, it's what really matters. Love is the doing of the law. That's what this is teaching. And I have to tell you the truth, or I'll be condemned by my own conscience. He is under the law of God through Christ. And the love of God, that's why the law is written on your heart. And yes, part of loving God is honoring that he is the true creator who rested on the seventh day Sabbath.